The film begins and we see a man named John. His house was located in the middle of the jungle. John was sitting comfortably when he suddenly heard a voice. He turned around and was shocked to see a group of dangerous men, enemies of the local people. Realizing the danger, John quickly got up and ran toward his house. At the same time, John's father, who was sleeping inside, also heard the commotion. He looked outside to assess the situation and was terrified to see the enemies approaching their house. By this time, John had also reached home. Without wasting any time, both father and son began packing their belongings. They prepared to leave through the back door, taking John's wife with them. Her condition was dire, she was gravely ill and too weak to walk properly. John's father quickly realized they wouldn't be able to escape far because of his daughter-in-law's condition. Seeing no other option, he decided to hide John and his wife in a pit that resembled an old, dirty box. It was an unpleasant place, but their safety depended on staying hidden. After ensuring their safety, John's father armed himself with a rod-like weapon and went out to confront the invaders alone. He fought valiantly, managing to kill 3 or 4 enemies. But he was outnumbered, and the enemies, who were ruthless, overpowered him. In one brutal blow, they killed him mercilessly. From their hiding spot, John and his wife witnessed the entire ordeal. They were devastated and helpless, unable to do anything. The enemies looted their house, taking everything valuable, including a bag that John had accidentally left behind. That bag was crucial. It contained the medicine his wife needed to treat her infection. Their grief deepened when they saw the enemies desecrate John's father's body. Not only did they kill him, but they also carried his body away on a wooden plank as if it were a trophy. After the invaders left, John and his wife returned to their home, only to find it completely ransacked. The house was in ruins, and John's worry grew when he saw the worsening condition of his wife's wound. She had developed a high fever and fainted from exhaustion. Despair surrounded them and death seemed inevitable. But in this moment of darkness, John found courage. He gathered wood to repair their destroyed hut, creating a safe space for his wife. Afterward, he left some water for her and prepared to retrieve the stolen bag. The harsh winter made his mission even more difficult. The invaders had taken all their warm clothes, leaving John in just a t-shirt and shorts. He shivered as he moved forward, hungry and weak. Eventually, his body gave in and he collapsed from exhaustion. He was on the verge of giving up when he spotted a small child nearby. The child's innocent face gave him a renewed sense of hope. With newfound determination, John stood up and followed the child. As soon as the child noticed John, he became frightened and started running. John, desperate, began chasing after the child. The child's house was nearby. As soon as he entered, he closed the door behind him. John, determined, broke the door down with all his strength and entered the house. Inside, he saw an old man and the small child cowering in fear beside him. Both of them were shivering from the cold and terrified of John, thinking he might harm them. However, John's only intention was to take some warm clothes. Without saying a word, he quietly picked up a few garments and left the house. He continued following the enemy's footprints until he reached a new location. What he saw there left him in shock. All that remained of his father were bones. The enemies had eaten the flesh from his body. Overwhelmed with grief, John buried his father's bones on the spot. This tragedy fueled John's anger. He vowed to take revenge on the enemies and pressed forward with determination. Eventually, he came across a tent in the distance. Instead of entering directly, he threw a stone at the tent to ensure no one was inside. Once he was certain the tent was empty, he cautiously went in. Inside, he found a few useful items: a box, a matchstick, a knife, and a whistle. He took them with him, knowing they could come in handy later. As he continued on his journey, he realized he was lost. He kept ending up at the same place despite moving in different directions. Frustrated, he climbed a tall tree to get a better view of the area. From the treetop, he spotted smoke rising in the distance. But as he was climbing down, he lost his grip and fell from a great height. The loud sound of his fall alerted nearby wild dogs, whose barking grew louder as they approached. Injured and unable to run due to a deep wound in his leg, John began crawling to safety. Night fell, and the fear of the wild dogs grew stronger. Thinking quickly, John gathered wood and lit a fire to keep the dogs at bay. He burned a piece of wood and used it as a torch to ward them off. Terrified of the flames, the dogs eventually retreated. Exhausted and relieved, John fell asleep beside the fire. The next morning, when he woke up, the dogs were gone. As he continued his journey, he noticed blood flowing into the river. Curious and cautious, he backtracked a little and discovered a woman washing a bloodied knife in the water. John observed her from a distance, careful not to reveal himself. When the woman left, he followed her quietly. Eventually, he discovered that she was one of the enemies and followed her to their hideout. When he reached the hideout, he noticed only the woman was there. Taking advantage of the situation, John moved carefully toward the house. However, he noticed wires tied to a bell, clearly set up as an alarm system. John carefully avoided the trap and spotted his bag inside the house, but when he checked it, all the medicines were missing. Frantic, he began searching the house for the medicines. Unbeknownst to him, the woman had seen him and was approaching him from behind. She attacked John, but he fought back. Despite his weakness from hunger and injury, John overpowered her. He picked up a large stone and struck her on the head, killing her instantly. After the fight, John searched the cupboards and found nothing. He looked outside and saw that the other enemies had returned. Quickly, he cleaned up the blood and erased all evidence of the fight. He dragged the woman's body out of the house and hid it behind a tree. While doing so, his axe fell and made a noise, attracting the attention of the enemies. John hid behind a tree and watched as the enemies discovered the axe. They became suspicious and started searching the area. John covered the woman's body with leaves to hide it better and lay down to avoid detection. Eventually, the enemies returned to their camp, bringing with them the same little boy John had encountered earlier. John felt helpless as he watched them prepare to cook. The boy, scared, cried out. John realized he had to act quickly. When the enemies were distracted, he crawled toward the boy and freed him from his ropes. The boy, terrified, initially thought John meant to harm him and screamed. This alerted the enemies, but John managed to calm the boy and help him escape before they arrived. John then re-entered the house and found a locked wooden box. He was sure the medicines were inside. He tried to break the lock but failed. Meanwhile, the leader of the enemies returned and noticed that the lock had been tampered with. The leader alerted his companions. John quickly hid under the house and waited. That night, John watched as the enemies burned the body of their female companion. Back at his home, John's wife regained consciousness. Not finding John there, she tried to leave the house. But the door was locked from the inside, and her injuries made it impossible for her to open it. Weak and exhausted, she collapsed on the floor. John, still hiding, waited all night for the enemies to leave. When morning came and the enemies were asleep, John quietly entered their camp. He carefully approached the leader and, without waking him, stole the key hanging from his neck. Using the key, he opened the locked box. His assumption was correct. The medicines were inside. John quickly grabbed the medicine and locked the box again before leaving. But in his haste, he failed to notice the bell wire. As soon as he tripped over it, the bell rang loudly, waking the leader and the rest of the enemies. The enemies immediately started chasing him. John tried to run, but his weakness slowed him down, and soon they caught him. They stripped him of his warm clothes and tied him to the ground. It seemed like they were preparing to cook him as they started building a fire nearby. John noticed a whistle lying close to him. He grabbed it and blew it loudly. The sound attracted the attention of nearby wild dogs, whose barking grew louder and closer. Hearing the approaching dogs, the leader panicked. He quickly injured one of his companions, leaving him behind as bait for the dogs. The dogs chased the injured man while the leader escaped alone. Taking advantage of the chaos, John used a knife to cut the ropes binding him. He hid behind a nearby tree, avoiding the dogs, and was able to save his life. John quickly retrieved his clothes and fled the camp. Unbeknownst to him, the leader was tracking him. John, exhausted and unaware, sat down under a tree to rest. Suddenly, the leader emerged from behind and kicked him hard, throwing him to the ground. The leader had no intention of sparing John, but John fought back courageously. The fight was brutal, but in the end, John managed to kill the leader mercilessly. As John recovered, another enemy arrived at the scene. He saw what appeared to be John dragging the leader's body away, but in reality it was a trick. John had switched clothes with the dead leader, disguising himself to confuse the enemy. The enemy, suspicious but unaware of the trick, approached John. Before he could react, John attacked and killed him as well. Now John moved forward with a clear plan in mind, to deal with the leader once and for all. The leader, standing at a distance, showed no fear despite everything. John aimed an arrow at him, and it struck the leader's leg, causing him to fall. Seeing this, John rushed toward him, ready to fire another arrow. The leader, now helpless, closed his eyes and awaited death. But John's aim faltered, and the arrow missed. With the advantage lost, the two were now on equal footing. Each armed with a knife, they stood face to face, ready for a final fight. Just as the fight was about to begin, the sound of wild dogs interrupted them. Hearing the barking, John ran to safety. The leader, wounded and unable to run far, was overtaken by the wild dogs. The pack tore into him, ending his life brutally. John's revenge was complete. He had defeated all the enemies and recovered his wife's medicine. He rushed back to his house. After all his struggles, he arrived home, only to find the door open and his wife missing. Heartbroken, John assumed the worst, that she had fallen prey to wild animals. Overwhelmed with despair, he sank to the ground and wept. But just then, his wife appeared from behind. She had survived by praying and taking measures to protect herself. Overjoyed, the two embraced, relieved to see each other alive and safe. And with this, their harrowing ordeal came to an end.